All right, your international law exam is coming up, so let's lock in the core concepts you absolutely need to know to pass. We're jumping right in. We're going to laser focus on the essentials. What makes a state a state? What does sovereignty actually mean in the real world? And how do powerful organizations like the EU kind of rewrite the rules? This is your high yield review for the exam, so let's get into it. Okay, first key term, a subject of international law. What does that even mean? Well, simply put, if an entity has legal personality, it's a real player on the global stage. It means it can sign treaties, it can make legal claims, and importantly, it can be held responsible for its actions. If it doesn't have that personality, it's just an object of the law, not a subject. Now, the primary subjects are, of course, states. And this is a classic exam question. What makes a state a state? The 1933 Montevideo Convention gives us the definitive four-part test. You need a defined territory, a permanent population, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. You've got to know these four cold. And a diplomatic passport is really the perfect symbol of this. It's not just some travel document. It's a representation of the state's unique legal personality. It basically says, hey, the person holding this acts on behalf of a sovereign entity with full capacity on the world stage. So this is where things get a little tricky, and it's a great point for an exam. In theory, the declarative view says, look, if you meet those four criteria, you're a state, end of story. But in practice, the constitutive theory often wins out. It says you're only truly a state if other states recognize you as one. I mean, without that recognition, good luck getting a seat at the UN, right? And that brings us to sovereignty. The landmark Lotus case set the default rule. A state can do pretty much anything it wants unless there's a specific rule that says it can't. But, and this is a huge but, the Wimbledon case gave us the crucial counterpoint. When a state willingly signs a treaty, it isn't losing sovereignty, it's exercising it. That's a really key distinction to grasp. So sovereignty gives a state jurisdiction, the power to apply its laws. There are 5 main grounds for this. The most obvious is territoriality. The crime happens on your land. Then there's nationality. You can prosecute your own citizens for crimes they commit abroad. Passive personality lets you go after foreigners for crimes against your citizens. The protective principle covers threats to your national security. And finally, universality applies to the absolute worst crimes, like genocide, allowing any state to prosecute. But hey, states aren't the only actors in the game anymore. We have international organizations, and for your exam, you absolutely must know this distinction. In intergovernmental organizations like the UN, states cooperate, but they hold on tight to their sovereignty. But in supranational organizations like the EU, member states have actually pooled some of their sovereignty, letting the organization create laws that apply directly inside their borders. Huge difference. The EU's old 3-pillar structure is a perfect way to see this in action. The first pillar, which handled economic stuff, was supranational. The organization could make binding laws. But the other 2 pillars, for foreign policy and justice, those were intergovernmental. There, the member states kept control and had to agree on everything. It just goes to show how an organization can mix both models. And this is the case that established the most important principle of EU law, supremacy. In Costa v. Enel, the court basically declared that if a national law clashes with an EU law, the EU law wins. Every time. As the quote says, domestic law cannot override it. This principle of primacy is the very foundation of the entire EU legal system. So how does the EU actually make these powerful laws? Well, it has 3 main tools in its legal toolkit. Regulations are like federal laws. They apply everywhere immediately. Directives set a goal that all countries have to achieve, but they let each country figure out how to do it in their own national laws. And then, decisions are specific, binding orders aimed at a particular person, company, or member state. Okay, it's really easy to confuse these different courts, so let's get this crystal clear. The International Criminal Court, the ICC, prosecutes individuals for the worst international crimes you can imagine. In contrast, the European Court of Human Rights, which is part of the Council of Europe, hears cases brought by individuals against states for human rights violations. Honestly, this comparison is pure exam gold. The CJEU is in Luxembourg, it's the EU's court, and it deals with EU law. The ECHR is in Strasbourg. It belongs to the Council of Europe, and it deals with the European Convention on Human Rights. Make sure you know the system, the location, and the mandate for each one. All right. Finally, how does international law become something you can actually enforce in a country? Well, there are 2 main approaches. In a monist system, once a treaty is ratified, it's automatically part of domestic law. Simple. But in a dualist system, international and national law are seen as two separate things. A treaty has no domestic power until the national parliament passes a specific law to implement it. So, now you have the core concepts. The best next step is to really test your knowledge. You can find a full summary of all this material and a whole set of practice exams to make sure you're ready to go at gradeguru.nl. Okay, let's do a super quick recap of the absolute essentials. 1. Statehood equals those 4 Montevideo criteria. 2. Sovereignty means you can consent to be bound by treaties. Remember the Wimbledon case? 3. Know the difference between intergovernmental and supranational. 4. EU law supreme. Think Costa VNL. And 5. Do not mix up the CJEU and the ECHR. So, as a final thought, remember that this state-centric model we've just talked about isn't set in stone. With the rise of powerful corporations, global NGOs, and even influential individuals, the big question for the future really is, how are these non-state actors going to challenge and reshape the very foundations of international law? Something to think about.